Dear listeners, we would love to get to know you better. Please write in the comments which country and city you are watching us from. Thank you. My parents, Jack and Linda, met in the early 1970s when my dad was a traveling salesman passing through Bakersfield, California. My mom, working as a diner waitress and full of hope for a brighter future, fell for his charm and promises of stability. They had a whirlwind romance that quickly led to marriage and the birth of my older sister Janet. Despite Dad's assurances of a good life, his frequent absences and unpredictable income hinted at the struggles ahead. By the time I was born, Dad's sales career had hit a dead end, leaving us in constant financial uncertainty. We moved frequently, chasing opportunities that never panned out. The constant relocations combined with Dad's growing gambling problem made life increasingly unstable. My mom, despite everything, was the glue that held us together. We worked tirelessly at multiple jobs, ensuring we always had food on the table. When my younger brother Eric arrived 2 years after me, his birth brought both joy and more challenges. My dad, unable to handle the mounting pressure, started disappearing for days at a time. Mom, determined to protect us from the chaos, took on a full-time job as a supermarket cashier. Her strength and resilience became the foundation of our family, even as Dad's behavior became more erratic. One night, after a particularly heated argument, my dad packed his things and left for good. His departure devastated us financially, forcing Mom to move us into a trailer park on the outskirts of Fresno. That marked the beginning of a tough but defining period in our lives. Janet and I took on responsibilities beyond our years, helping with chores and looking after Eric, whose mischievous nature often tested our patience. Even with the challenges we faced, I found comfort in academics and part-time jobs. Excelling in school became my way of contributing, and I earned recognition for my efforts. Janet, too, thrived, displaying a determination that mirrored Mom's unwavering strength. Eric, on the other hand, struggled to find his place, and our relationship grew increasingly strained due to our different perspectives on life. During my teenage years, I began to dream of escaping the trailer park and building a better future. A teacher who believed in me encouraged my participation in extracurricular activities and guided me towards scholarship opportunities. Those aspirations became my driving force, shaping my ambition and preparing me for the life I was determined to achieve, even as they further strained my bond with Eric. My name is Paul Scott. Standing just shy of 6 feet and weighing around 170 pounds, I've been told I have a pleasing appearance, though I'll leave that for others to decide. I grew up in the Central Valley of California, near Fresno, sharing a cramped, double-wide trailer with my mother, younger brother Eric, and sister Janet. The trailer was so close to the railroad tracks that our dinners were often signaled by the rumble of a passing freight train at 6 o'clock. My mother, weary after her long shifts as a cashier, would come home just in time to prepare our evening meal. We ended up living there after my dad, Jack, walked out on us. He left with his girlfriend, contributing little more than occasional child support before disappearing from our lives altogether. Mom raised the 3 of us on her own. Despite the instability, Janet and I managed to stay on track. Graduating from high school and college with the help of scholarships, I earned a degree in marketing while Janet went on to become a lawyer. Eric, well, he and I never saw eye to eye. He resented my achievements, though he had the kind of looks people noticed: blonde hair, blue eyes, and a charm I lacked. He worked steady jobs, from bagging groceries in high school to construction work as an adult, but ambition was never his strong suit. In 1985, I landed a marketing position at a small California startup, which later grew into a major player during the internet boom. After 16 years, the company was acquired, and I left with a VP title, stock options, and a hefty severance package. That windfall bought me a mansion in Palo Alto, a Porsche, and a house for Mom. For a while, life was golden, until my marriage to Tiffany unraveled and left me nearly broke. Tiffany, who married me just weeks before my severance payout, took half my fortune, our home, and the Porsche in the divorce. To top it off, I discovered through a DNA test that our son, Paul Jr., wasn't mine. He was Eric's. Tiffany had been having an affair with him. The fallout didn't stop there. Eric's wife, Amrita, found out, took their daughters, and moved back to India. Although I avoided paying child support and had my name removed from Paul Jr.'s birth certificate, losing him cut deeper than anything else. Even for a short time, it made me question why my own father abandoned us. I swore I'd find his grave someday, just to leave a mark on it. That year was a blur of heartbreak and regret. By the following March, my divorce was finalized, and I was emotionally drained. I decided to leave California for New Mexico, drawn by the promise of affordable living and a chance to start over. Before leaving, I splurged on one thing, a restored 1974 VW van, like the one I'd driven in my youth. It was far from perfect, weathered and worn, but it ran like a dream and felt like a piece of my past I could hold on to. I drove 950 miles over 2 days, cutting through Arizona and into New Mexico. The first night, I stopped at a truck stop in Kingman, Arizona, a place that had once been a hub for Western films in the 1940s and 50s. By the second day, I reached Gallup, New Mexico, a small city of about 21,000 people with a modest median income of $35,000. After spending a night in a budget motel, I toured several mobile home parks. Eventually, I settled on a single wide one-bedroom trailer in the Western Skies Mobile Home Park. It wasn't much to look at, worn and rough around the edges, but it was functional, furnished, and mine for just $5,273. While unpacking, I noticed my neighbor, a petite woman with her dark hair tied back in a ponytail. Wanting to make a friendly introduction and hoping for a fresh start with someone far removed from the chaos of my past, I brought over some flowers and cookies from a local market. When I knocked, a young boy with jet black hair opened the door and stared at me silently. Moments later, the woman appeared. She was smaller than I'd expected, barely reaching 5 feet, dressed simply in a blue dress and old sandals. Her glasses were patched with duct tape, and a faint palsy affected her face, yet she had a kind, striking presence. I introduced myself as her new neighbor and offered the flowers and cookies. She smiled warmly and introduced herself as Aurora Santos, dawn to her friends and her son Jacob, who was 4. She explained that Jacob stared at men because his father had abandoned them. Aurora invited me in for coffee. Over cookies, she told me her story. Her ex-husband was serving time for domestic maltreatment, which had left her with nerve damage. She was raising Jacob alone, working as a pharmacy cashier and relying on food stamps to get by. I shared my own story, how my marriage fell apart, and how I discovered the child I thought was mine wasn't. We talked for hours, and by the time I left we'd become friends. Her goodbye hug lingered with me, stirring emotions I wasn't ready to face. The next day, I stocked up on essentials, a mattress, cookware, groceries, and a 32-inch TV on sale. Although I still had a financial cushion, I knew I needed steady work. A temp agency soon placed me in a job unloading trucks at a shipping company. Over time, I settled into a routine: work, meals, TV, and sleep. Saturdays became grocery trips with Aurora and Jacob, who had quickly warmed up to me. If Jacob wanted to treat Aurora couldn't afford, I'd buy it for him and share it later. Sundays were for laundry. She washed while I played with Jacob and helped fold clothes. I might have sneaked a glance at her undergarments once or twice, not to take them, just to imagine. Though life was simple, it felt steady for the first time in years. Aurora and I grew close, supporting each other in small but meaningful ways. If she worked late, I'd pick up Jacob from daycare and handle his bedtime routine. Seeing Jacob brought back memories of the life I'd imagined with Tiffany and our son, but I pushed those thoughts aside. By October, I realized I wanted more than friendship with Aurora. My feelings deepened when, during a grocery trip, a rude cashier sneered at her for using food stamps, muttering something cruel under her breath. Aurora's hand trembled as she paid, her head bowed in shame. That moment made me realize just how much she meant to me. I stepped forward and handed over my platinum card. "She's not what you think," I said firmly, locking eyes with the cashier. "She's my girlfriend. I'll cover this." The cashier quickly dropped her attitude, swiping the card without another word. Outside, as I loaded the groceries into the car, Dawn brushed away tears. "You didn't have to do that, Paul," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied with a casual shrug. "You paid for my groceries," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "And you told her I was your girlfriend. That's not true." I shrugged again, trying to downplay it. "Look, Dawn, you're a wonderful person, and you don't deserve to be treated like that. As for the girlfriend thing, well, maybe it doesn't have to be a lie." Her eyes widened in surprise. "What are you saying?" Summoning my courage, I took a step closer and wrapped my arms around her. Not the kind of distant hug you give a casual acquaintance, but a genuine embrace. "I'm saying I'd like you to be my girlfriend," I said softly. Dawn pulled back slightly, caught off guard. "I need to think about this. I wasn't expecting it," she admitted. Later that evening, as I unpacked groceries in my trailer, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, Dawn stood there. "Come on in," I said with a grin. "If you were my girlfriend, you wouldn't even have to knock." She stepped inside, looking serious. "Paul, earlier, were you joking about wanting me as your girlfriend?" I took her hands in mine, holding her gaze. "I wasn't joking. I meant every word. I want us to be more than just neighbors." She hesitated, her voice tinged with doubt. "But why?" "I'm broke. I'm single. I'm 32 years old and living off food stamps. I'm scared, Paul. You could be with anyone. Why me?" Her words stung, not because of their truth, but because of how little she valued herself. "Dawn, I don't see you the way you see yourself," I said earnestly. "From the moment I met you, I thought you were beautiful. And the more I've gotten to know you, the more I've seen your kindness, your strength, and your heart." I stood and gently pulled her to her feet. Looking directly into her eyes, I added, "And yes, I think you're incredibly attractive. You said I could have anyone, but the truth is, I want you." Without giving her a chance to respond, I leaned in and kissed her. Her lips were different, slightly altered by the nerve damage. But that didn't matter. Holding her close, I whispered against her hair, "You're perfect to me." Dawn sighed, her voice tinged with hope and hesitation. "You're a man, Paul Scott, and men often get things wrong, but I want to believe you." Her words could have sounded harsh, but the softness in her tone and expression made them anything but. After a pause, she gave her answer. "All right, I'll be your girlfriend, but on one condition. You have to start coming to Sunday Mass with Jacob and me. If you're serious, you need to set a good example for my son." She sealed her terms with a slow, lingering kiss. I hadn't stepped inside a church since my wedding, and honestly, I had no desire to go back. But that kiss made the decision easy. "Deal," I whispered. Not entirely sure what being a role model entailed, but determined to try. Before leaving, she kissed me again and said softly, "Take it slow, Paul. I really like you, but I've been through a lot. I'm not some city girl looking to trap a man no matter how charming he is. If you want my heart, you'll have to be patient." She left with a spring in her step, leaving me feeling hopeful for the first time in years. The next day, Dawn arranged for a neighbor to watch Jacob while we ran errands together. At the ATM, I withdrew $200 and handed it to her. She protested, but I waved her off. "I'm your boyfriend now. Spoiling you is part of the job." "Thank you, Paul," she said softly, her resistance fading. At the grocery store, she asked me to wait in the van. Stretching out in the back seat, I dozed off until the sound of groceries being loaded woke me. A moment later, I felt the warmth of her lips on mine. Smiling, I pulled her into my lap. "Miss me already?" I teased. She laughed, her blouse's top button slightly undone. "Jealous much?" She teased back, flashing a playful smile. Of course I am, I said, kissing her neck. You're mine now, no one else gets to have you. She laughed and slipped out of my arms. Let's get these groceries home before they spoil, she said, planting another quick kiss on my lips before heading to the passenger seat. Back at the trailer, Dawn cooked while Jacob and I played games and watched a Disney movie. The warm evening air carried the smell of roast pork and biscuits, making my mouth water. When she finally called us to dinner, the table was set with plates of machado, a Filipino beef and pork dish, and freshly baked biscuits. This is incredible, I said, savoring the flavors. What did I do to deserve all this? Dawn smiled, her eyes glowing with affection. You take care of me and Jacob without expecting anything in return. You deserve to be spoiled too. Overwhelmed, I pulled her into my lap, holding her close. Aurora, Dawn Santos, get used to me, because I'm falling for you hard. Her response was another deep, heartful kiss. For the first time in years, I felt truly content. I had a steady job, a boy who looked up to me, and a woman who cared for me. Life, with all its twists and turns, was finally starting to feel right again. After dinner, I started clearing the table and washing the dishes. Dawn, meanwhile, took Jacob to brush his teeth and get ready for bed. As I was rinsing the last plate, she returned to the kitchen just as I was about to tackle the pots and pans. Noticing my progress, she grabbed a dish towel, looped it around my neck, and pulled me in for a quick kiss. With a teasing grin, she said, "Hey, you're being summoned. Jacob wants you to help him with his bedtime prayers." I headed to the back of the trailer, where Jacob was already on his knees by his bed, hands clasped and waiting patiently. I knelt beside him, feeling a little out of my depth but willing to give it a shot. His small, serious voice broke the silence. "God bless, Mommy. God bless Lola and Lola in the Philippines. God bless Mrs. Meyer for helping take care of me. And God bless Mr. Paul for playing with me and making Mommy happy again. Amen." When he stopped and looked at me expectantly, I realized it was my turn. Folding my hands, I tried my best. God bless my mom and my sister Janet. God bless Mrs. Meyer for being such a kind neighbor. God bless Jacob, my new buddy. I hesitated briefly, searching for the right words. And God bless Dawn for showing me that love is still possible. Amen. Apparently I passed the test because Jacob grinned and threw his arms around my neck. I hugged him back, then tucked him in and kissed his forehead. "Good night, buddy. Good night, Mr. Paul," he said sleepily. Then he added, "And don't forget to send Mommy in for my good night kiss." I smiled and nodded, heading back to the kitchen. Dawn was scrubbing the pans, humming softly. Without a word, I slipped my hands under her arms, lifted her off the ground, and brought her level with me. She laughed in surprise as I kissed her. "This is starting to feel like a scene from a Hallmark movie," I said with a smirk. She chuckled as I set her down. "Jacob's waiting for his kiss. Good night," she said, wrapping her arms around me. "Don't go too far. Your girlfriend doesn't want you getting lonely." I sat on the couch while Dawn went to Jacob's room. Stretching out, I turned on the TV and flipped to a basketball game. But it barely held my attention. A few minutes later, I felt her weight settle onto my lap, and the game was forgotten entirely. As we kissed like a couple of teenagers, the intensity between us built. My hands instinctively moved to the hem of her blouse, but she caught them gently and pulled them away. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice tinged with regret. "I want this too, but it's just too soon. Please don't be upset." I kissed her forehead and held her close, letting my heart slow. "It's okay, Dawn. I meant what I said. I'm falling for you. I'll wait as long as you need." She nestled against me, her tears dampening my shirt. That shirt became sacred to me at that moment. Her tears a badge of trust. Later, when she walked me to the door, she turned to me with a soft smile and said, "Thank you for being so patient with me. If it helps, I think I'm falling for you too." Those words left me walking on air. It helps a lot, I replied, grinning as I stepped outside. Good night, my love. She closed the door, and I couldn't stop smiling. The next morning at work, I went through the motions, but my mind was elsewhere. Dawn occupied nearly every thought. Looking back on my marriage to Tiffany, I realized how shallow our relationship had been. Sure, the physical connection had been exciting, but it lacked depth. Money had papered over problems, but it couldn't build trust or loyalty. Tiffany's betrayal had proved that. With Dawn, it was different. Without sex as a foundation, we were focusing on truly getting to know each other. We talked about everything, our favorite foods, hopes for the future, and the possibility of leaving Gallup when the time was right. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building something real. Still, there was one topic I avoided, my dream of being a father. Losing little Paul had left a wound that hadn't fully healed. I was 37 now and couldn't shake the thought of becoming a dad before I was mistaken for a grandpa. It turned out I didn't have to bring it up myself. One warm October afternoon, I was sitting in my trailer with the windows open, sipping a cold beer, when I overheard a conversation between Dawn and our neighbor, Mrs. Meyer. Dawn's gentle laugh floated through the air as Mrs. Meyer's voice carried across the yard. Unintentionally, I leaned closer to the window, curious to hear where the conversation might lead. Dawn had just finished paying Mrs. Meyer for babysitting Jacob, and they exchanged some polite small talk. Before long, Mrs. Meyer switched to what she did best, dishing out unsolicited advice. A stellar babysitter she might have been, but she also had a knack for meddling in everyone's personal business. Jacob is such a sweetheart, Mrs. Meyer began, her voice loud enough to carry across the lot. He's too good to grow up without a sibling, don't you agree? Dawn's response was quiet, but audible through my open window. I think a brother or sister would be lovely, but I'm not in a position. Mrs. Meyer cut her off with a laugh. Not in a position, honey. You've got yourself a man who adores you. Maybe it's time you got in position, preferably underneath him. Mrs. Meyer, Dawn exclaimed, clearly mortified. Paul is my boyfriend, yes, but we haven't. Oh, I know. Mrs. Meyer interrupted with a knowing tone. Plenty of nights, I see him walking back to his trailer like he's carrying a bowling ball in his pants. I nearly choked on my beer. Forget hidden cameras. Mrs. Meyer clearly had eyes everywhere. And let me tell you something, sweetie, she continued, now fully in her element. If I were 15 years younger, I'd be after that man myself. And I'm not the only one. There's plenty of ladies in this park who've noticed Paul. They'd jump at the chance to snatch him up. But that fool only has eyes for you, droopy side and all. Poor Dawn didn't stand a chance. With Mrs. Meyer's booming voice, I caught every word as she drove her point home. Now listen here, Mrs. Meyer went on. You're the queen of Paul Scott's heart, but if you want to keep that crown, you'd better start thinking about taking him to bed. The man's crazy about you, and you know it. He's great with your boy, and I'd bet my last nickel he'd be over the moon if you gave him a child of his own. I almost dropped my beer. While Mrs. Meyer's delivery left much to be desired, her words hit a nerve. The truth was, I would be overjoyed if Dawn had my child. It was like she'd plucked the thoughts straight from my head and laid it bare. That night, sleep was impossible. Even after a couple more beers, I found myself tossing and turning. The heat wasn't helping, and neither was the image of Dawn pregnant with our child. I'd promised her patience, but the desire was overwhelming. As I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, I heard the faint click of a key turning in the lock. Only one person had a key to my trailer. I stayed still, curious to see what Dawn was up to. She stepped quietly into the room, slipped off her shoes, and padded toward my bed. When her lips brushed mine, I opened my eyes to find her standing there, silhouetted by the soft glow of streetlights outside. She wore her hair loosely tied back in an old bathrobe that somehow made her look more alluring than any runway model. "Do you really love me?" she whispered. Caught off guard by the question, I kept my response simple. "Of course I do. If that's true, you'll do exactly as I say. No questions, she said, her tone gentle but firm. Surprised by her sudden assertiveness, I nodded. She pulled a cheap sleep mask from her robe pocket and slipped it over my eyes, leaving me in darkness. "What about your ex-wife?" she asked. "What if she wanted you back?" "No way," I said without hesitation. "After what she did, she's nothing to me." "And the women here in the park?" "Mrs. Meyer says some of them would throw themselves at you in a heartbeat. They're prettier than me, and they give you everything you want without making you wait." "Dawn, stop," I said, struggling to think clearly. "None of that matters. I don't want anyone else, I want you." Her lips met mine again, silencing me. When she pulled back, her voice softened. "I know it's been hard for you to wait. It's been hard for me too. Every time you hold me, I want more. But there's so much pain in my past, so many things I'm still working through." Hearing this broke my heart. "Dawn, you know I'd never pressure you, right? I'd never hurt you like that." "I know," she said, her voice steady. "You've been so patient, and that's one of the reasons I love you. Tonight, I just wanted to be close to you." "You don't have to explain," I said gently. "If you're not ready, I'll wait." She rested her head on my chest, her voice barely a whisper. "I am falling in love with you, Paul, but I need time." After a moment, she kissed me again and sat up. "I should go. Jacob will wake up soon, and I can't leave him alone." She stood, tying her robe back in place, then leaned down for one final kiss. "Thank you for understanding," she murmured. "We'll get there when the time is right." As the door closed behind her, I lay there, replaying her words in my head. I knew this was worth waiting for. Whatever it took, I was all in. After that early morning moment with Dawn, I found myself falling even harder for her. At home, I'd find excuses to steal kisses or hold her hand. Jacob and I even turned it into a playful game. If I kissed Dawn, I'd ask him, "What kind of day is it today?" On double kiss days, as Jacob called them, I'd kiss her again. Jacob would burst into laughter, delighted to be the one deciding how many kisses his mommy deserved. As my feelings grew deeper, I also became more protective of her. Determined to make her life easier, I withdrew $2,500 from my savings and bought her a used 2014 Toyota Corolla. It wasn't flashy. Its exterior had seen better days, but I made sure it was reliable and safe, having a mechanic give it a thorough tune-up. When I handed her the keys, Dawn let out a laugh that quickly turned into tears. She pulled me into her trailer, where we kissed like a pair of teenagers discovering love for the first time. Not long after, I took her to an eye doctor to address her ongoing issues with dry eyes. He prescribed medicated drops, and we ordered her a sleek pair of tortoise-shell glasses from Dolce & Gabbana. 2 weeks later, when the new glasses arrived, they transformed her look completely. The combination of the stylish frames and her natural beauty gave her a naughty librarian allure. That night, I couldn't resist teasing her, whispering, "Don't shush me too hard, or I'll owe you overdue fines." Meanwhile, work was looking up. My performance earned me a transition from part-time temp to full-time with benefits, along with a raise. A month later, I was promoted to shipping supervisor. Things were finally falling into place. Buoyed by my growing confidence, I decided it was time to take the next step with Dawn. I bought a ring and planned to propose at the company holiday party in December. Although my divorce wouldn't be finalized until March, reconciliation with Tiffany was out of the question. To me, putting a diamond on Dawn's finger was a way to solidify our future and ease any lingering insecurities she might have about our relationship. At our cozy Thanksgiving dinner, I invited Dawn to the party. She hesitated, worrying that none of her clothes were fancy enough for such an event. That was an easy fix. I enlisted Mrs. Meyer's help, who introduced me to her sister, Betty Ward, a retired seamstress. Betty came over to take Dawn's measurements, and 2 weeks later, she returned with a stunning custom-made dress. They kept the design a surprise, leaving me only with the bill. On the night of the party, I went to pick up Dawn. Mrs. Meyer was already there, happily babysitting Jacob. When I told her we'd be back around midnight, she smirked and said, "Paul, if she's home before dawn, I'll know you didn't do it right." Then I heard Dawn's voice from behind me. "I'm ready, Paul." Turning around, my jaw nearly hit the floor. The dress was an elegant fire engine red number with a knee-length hem, a daringly low back, and a single shoulder sleeve that added a sophisticated touch while leaving her other shoulder exposed. It fit her like a glove, highlighting her figure in a way that made her earlier ironing board remark laughable. She was breathtaking. I, meanwhile, was wearing a tailored charcoal suit for my corporate days, but standing beside Dawn, I felt completely outclassed. Her hair, styled in a braided side bun, courtesy of Mrs. Meyer, added an extra layer of elegance. Even her shoes, a pair of matching red flats, were a practical yet perfect choice. Unlike Tiffany's perilous stilettos, they suited her effortlessly. When we walked into the hotel ballroom, heads turned almost immediately. I noticed several younger men snaking glances at Dawn. Sliding my arm around her waist, I leaned close and whispered, "We're not even 20 feet inside, and I've already caught guys checking you out. Should I be worried?" She squeezed my hand and smiled. "Paul, I'm not Tiffany. You'll never have to worry about me." We found seats at a table, and I pulled out her chair before grabbing us 2 glasses of champagne. The DJ soon announced the first dance of the evening, a slow song. Taking her hand, I led her to the dance floor. We moved in sync, holding each other close. One song flowed into another, and we stayed out there, lost in the moment. When the music shifted to a faster tempo, we returned to our table. Not long after, a younger man from accounting approached Dawn, asking her to dance. She politely declined, but later, another executive from sales made the same request. This time, I encouraged her to go. As she swayed with him to another slow song, I kept a watchful eye on them, ready to step in if necessary. It wasn't long before Dawn returned, her expression angry and her posture tense. She sat down and leaned toward me. "That man had the nerve to invite me to his room," she said, her voice low but furious. "He doesn't even know me." My initial jealousy evaporated, replaced by concern. "Are you okay?" I asked. She nodded. I told him the only man I'm interested in sharing a bed with is the one who brought me here. Then I walked away. It took me a moment to process her words. My heart raced as I stammered, "Dawn, are you saying that?" Before I could get another word out, Dawn slid into my lap, cradling my face in her hands. Her kiss was intense and filled with an emotion that made my heart pound. When she finally pulled back, her voice was soft but resolute. "Yes, Paul, you've been so kind and patient with me, always making me feel safe. I'm not scared anymore. Let's get a room and go upstairs." And just like that, a new chapter of my life began in room 538 of the historic El Rancho Hotel, right off Route 66. Once inside, I grabbed a small bottle of champagne from the minibar. It wasn't cheap, but in that moment it didn't matter. I poured 2 glasses and led Dawn out to the balcony. The city lights shimmered in the distance, painting a breathtaking backdrop. Standing behind her with my arms around her waist, I couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed. Months ago, my life had been in shambles, betrayed, broken, and left with half of what I once had. But now I had a stable job, a fresh start, and most importantly, a woman who had completely restored my faith and love. As we stood there, I realized it was time to take the next step. The evening breeze grew cooler, so I draped her shawl over her shoulders. Then, before she could turn back to me, I dropped to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from my pocket. She was still gazing out at the skyline when I reached up and lightly poked her side, making her laugh. "Paul, what are you?" Her voice faltered as she spun around and saw me kneeling. The open ring box in my hand. Her hands flew to her mouth and tears spilled down her cheeks. "Aurora Don Santos," I began, my voice steady despite the overwhelming emotions. "When I met you, I was at my absolute lowest. But you changed everything." The night you made Mikado for me, I knew you were the one I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. Will you marry me?" Through her tears, she nodded emphatically and extended her hand. I slipped the ring onto her finger and swept her off her feet, carrying her to the bed. That night, and well into the early hours of the morning, we celebrated our love in a way that felt nothing short of perfect. Dawn's commitment to starting a family was clear, and I couldn't have been happier. The next morning, we woke just in time for breakfast. Dawn cheekily requested a late checkout so we could enjoy one more round of celebrating. This time, she kept her new glasses on, teasing me with librarian-inspired shushes and playful finds whenever I groaned too loudly. When we finally returned to the trailer park around noon, still in our party attire, it didn't take long to draw attention. Dawn's reputation as a wholesome church-going single mom seemed at odds with the night we just had. The disapproving glances aimed at me quickly transformed into smiles when Dawn proudly showed off her engagement ring. Mrs. Meyer was thrilled, and Jacob couldn't contain his excitement about having me as his soon-to-be stepdad. With the engagement official done, and I stopped hiding our relationship, if Jacob was already asleep, we didn't hesitate to share a bed. Though we tried to keep things modest, sometimes our good-night kisses led to more. And honestly, I wasn't complaining. 5 Sundays later, at St. Francis Church, I was blindsided by a revelation that would change everything. Father Thomas was giving a sermon on Genesis 128, "Be fruitful and multiply." And at the end of the service, he invited expectant mothers to come forward for a blessing. To my utter astonishment, Dawn stood up and joined them. I gripped the pew to steady myself, resisting the urge to jump up and cheer. While she wasn't showing yet, I leaned down and whispered to Jacob, "You're going to be a big brother." He blinked at me, confused, but I couldn't explain further. When Dawn returned to the pew, I pulled her into a tight hug, whispering, "I love you more than anything." With my divorce just weeks away from being finalized, I was eager to marry Dawn, my fiancée, and the mother of my child. By late February, at 12 weeks along, her petite frame was already showing a noticeable baby bump. Every night, I sang to it and kissed it, overwhelmed by the joy of knowing this child was mine. Unlike the pain I'd endured with little Paul, no one would ever take this baby from me. Life seemed perfect until one Saturday, while grocery shopping with Dawn and Jacob, my phone buzzed. Caller ID revealed it was my younger sister Janet. This was unusual. She lived in San Diego, and we hadn't spoken since Christmas at Mom's house right before my marriage imploded. She'd stayed silent during the divorce, and given her closeness to Eric, I assumed she'd taken his side. The call could only mean 2 things. Either something was wrong with Mom or my lousy brother Eric was in trouble and needed a favor. If it was Mom, I'd stay on the line. If it was Eric, I was hanging up. "What's up, Janet? Is Mom okay?" I asked. "She's fine," Janet replied quickly. "Good. Thanks for calling." I started to end the call, but her voice cut in sharply. "Wait, don't hang up, Paul," she exclaimed. I sighed, irritation bubbling up. "Janet, you know I don't care about that piece of crap brother of ours. Unless you're calling to say he's dead, this conversation is over." "Paul, listen," she said urgently. "Eric isn't in the U.S. anymore. He's gone to India to try and win back Amrita and the girls." I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Eric, apologizing. That's a first. I couldn't care less what happens to him. If he's in India, I hope he steps on a cobra. Goodbye, Janet. And with that, I ended the call, closing the door on that chapter of my life for good. As Dawn walked back from the produce aisle, she immediately noticed something was off. My mood was written all over my face. I started to explain, but before I could get the words out, my phone rang again. Janet, for the second time. "Unbelievable," I muttered, answering reluctantly. "What now, Janet? I told you I don't care about Eric." "Paul, stop cutting me off," she snapped. "This isn't about Eric. It's about Paul, Jr." The mention of his name felt like a knife twisting in my chest. My voice turned cold. His name is just Paul. He's not my son anymore, remember? My name is gone from his birth certificate. He's Eric's kid now, so why don't you hang up and leave me alone? Paul, please, she begged. You're angry and I get that. Eric ruined your life. There's no excuse for what he did. But Paul, Jr. is innocent. He's just a child, and he needs your help. My laugh was sharp and bitter. Help? From me? That kid is nothing to me. He's as dead to me as his parents are. The words came out harsher than I intended. Deep down, I knew Paul, Jr. was blameless, but the pain of losing him, of losing everything, still cut too deep. Saying his name opened wounds I wasn't ready to deal with. My voice had risen, drawing the attention of shoppers around me. Embarrassed and angry, I turned off my phone, grabbed Dawn and Jacob, and rushed us through the checkout line. The call haunted me for the rest of the evening, dredging up memories and emotions I'd worked hard to suppress. My mood cast a shadow over the household, affecting both Dawn and Jacob. Later that night, during Jacob's bedtime prayers, he blessed his usual list of people, his mom, his grandparents, and Mrs. Meyer. But when he got to me, his words stopped me in my tracks. God bless my new daddy, he said softly. And please don't let him forget how much he loves me. My heart shattered. Without thinking, I scooped Jacob into my arms, holding him close as tears streamed on my face. I love you, Jacob, I whispered, over and over, my voice breaking with each repetition. Dawn appeared in the doorway, her expression a mix of concern and tenderness. She gently took Jacob from my arms, tucked him into bed, and reassured him that I was just feeling sad, but loved him more than anything. Then she guided me to our room. Once inside, Dawn didn't say a word. She unbuttoned my shirt and helped me out of my jeans, then coaxed me to face down on the bed. Her hands moved gently over my back, kneading away the tension, while her lips followed with soft kisses along my spine. You'll be okay, she murmured, her voice gentle and soothing, her accent turning together into together. The way she said it was comforting and unexpectedly arousing at the same time. Hearing her voice, I felt something shift inside me. For months, I'd been holding everything in, trying to stay strong for everyone, ignoring my own pain. But in that moment, I realized I wasn't alone. Dawn and Jacob loved me, unconditionally. Tiffany and Eric no longer had power over me, and as I listened to Dawn's lilting voice, I couldn't help but smile. Everything about her, even her accent, made me feel alive. I turned over and pulled her close. She was wearing the same simple blue dress and practical sandals she'd had on the day we met, yet she looked more stunning than ever. I kissed her deeply, pouring all my emotions into the connection. That night, we made love, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. Later, as we lay together, my hand rested on Dawn's growing belly. My thoughts drifted to my mother, who was retired and living alone in the house I'd bought her in Fresno. With Eric and his family gone to India, she no longer had her granddaughters nearby, and I wondered if the news of 2 new grandchildren would lift her spirits. I kissed Dawn softly and asked, "How would you feel about meeting my mom?" She hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "If you want me to meet her, I'd love to." The next day, I called Mom to set up a visit. Her response was polite, but indifferent. "It'll be nice to see you," she said. "And having a little boy around again will be interesting." Dawn and I took a week off work and booked flights to Fresno. The weather was cool, so we wore hooded sweatshirts, which conveniently concealed Dawn's baby bump. I was looking forward to Mom's reaction when she realized the big news. When we arrived, I noticed the house looked better than ever. Mom had invested in landscaping and the front yard was pristine. She greeted Jacob and me warmly, hugging us tightly. But when it came to Dawn, her demeanor shifted. She extended a hand and said, "It's nice to meet you," with the kind of politeness reserved for strangers. My stomach churned at her coldness. We stepped inside and sat in the kitchen while Mom bustled around, pouring drinks and preparing a peanut butter sandwich for Jacob. Dawn and I asked for coffee, but the warmth of the gesture didn't match the chill in her tone. Once we were settled, she finally addressed me. "Paul," she began, her voice calm but deliberate. "Don't you think this engagement is a little rushed? Your divorce isn't even final yet. Dawn seems nice, and Jacob is a sweet boy, but maybe you should take more time to think things through." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to keep my tone even. "Mom," I said slowly, "let me remind you of something. Tiffany didn't make a mistake. She chose to betray me, to get pregnant by my brother. This isn't rushed. In a few weeks, my divorce will be final, and I'll be marrying the woman who loves me for who I am. I hope you can accept that." Mom reached across the table and placed her hand on Dawn's, her voice laced with a sweetness so false, it made my teeth ache. "Dawn seems lovely, Paul, and I'm sure she's very kind, but you had a good life before Tiffany's. Poor choices. I just think you're rushing into this. There's still time to reconsider things, maybe even reconcile." That word hit me like a slap. Reconcile. My mother, who had despised Tiffany since the day they met, was now suggesting I take her back. Before I could wrap my head around the absurdity of it, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My chest tightened as realization dawned. This wasn't just an uncomfortable conversation. This was a setup. The front door creaked open, followed by the unmistakable sound of 2 pairs of footsteps approaching. Mom turned to Jacob with a saccharine smile. "Sweetheart, let's go find something fun to watch on TV. The grown-ups need to talk, and it's nothing you'd enjoy." She guided him out of the room, leaving me and Dawn behind, just as 2 people stepped into the kitchen. The first was my sister Janet, holding Paul Jr. in her arms. The second was someone I'd hoped never to see again. "Tiffany," I said, my voice flat and cold. She attempted a weak smile. "Hi, Paul. You're looking well." I took a long, deliberate look at her. Despite the efforts of Botox and beauty treatments, her face looked tired and worn, as though the weight of her decisions had finally caught up with her. "Thanks," I said curtly. "You don't." Turning to Dawn, I said, "Can you call us a cab? We're leaving." Before Dawn could respond, Janet slid a large brown envelope across the table. I didn't touch it. "What is this, Janet?" I asked, my tone sharp. "It's the form to dismiss your divorce filing," she said matter-of-factly. "Tiffany wants to reconcile before things are finalized. Since you're the petitioner, you have to sign it." The audacity left me momentarily stunned. "Let me get this straight," I said slowly. "Who exactly are you representing here, Janet?" "I'm acting on Tiffany's behalf," she replied. "Paul Jr. is my nephew, and I believe he deserves to have his parents together." My voice hardened. "So let me get this right. My own sister and mother are siding with the woman who blew my life to pieces. That's what this is." Before Janet could respond, Tiffany stepped in, her voice trembling with fake sincerity. "Paul, please, just think about it. You loved me once. You loved Paul Jr. once. We can be a family again. The house is so empty without you." Her use of Junior only deepened my disgust, reminding me that the child was Eric's, not mine. "Empty." I shot back. "How ironic, considering you and Eric had no trouble filling it with your screwing." I was just in the way. I turned to the 3 women in front of me, my anger barely contained. "You're all living in a fantasy world. Tiffany, what makes you think I'd ever forgive what you did to me?" Tiffany fell to her knees and grabbed my legs, sobbing. "Paul, I made a horrible mistake. I didn't love Eric. It was meaningless. I ruined everything, and I'm so sorry. Please, I'll do anything. Just stay with me." Her desperation only fueled my contempt. Stone-faced, I responded, "If you thought this was a winning strategy, you miscalculated." She shifted tactics, her voice trembling with desperation. "Paul, if you stop the divorce, I'll give you everything back. The house, the cars, the money, all in your name. I'll even sign a post-nuptial agreement. We can go to therapy. Please just give me a chance. I stayed calm. "Tiffany," I began, my tone measured. "If you'd made this offer before I left for New Mexico, I might have thought about it. But then again, you and Eric were still screwing, weren't you? So no, there's no chance. Unless you can undo everything you've done, this conversation is over." Janet spoke up, her voice tinged with indignation. "Paul, don't walk away from this. Paul, Jr. is innocent. You can't just abandon him." I turned to her sharply. "I already have. And as far as I'm concerned, you've abandoned me by siding with her. Don't expect to be part of my life moving forward." Finally, I faced my mother. "I bought you this house because I wanted to give you a better life. But this ambush, it's beyond insulting. You hated Tiffany when we got married. Now you're on her side. Why?" Mom's voice cracked as she spoke, holding Paul Jr. close. "Because he's my grandson. He didn't do anything wrong. He deserves a good father." I took a deep breath, my voice trembling with anger. "He has a father, Mom, and it's not me. It will never be me. And until you disown Eric, you'll never see my children. That's the choice you've made." Mom's eyes widened. "Your children?" she asked, stunned. Dawn stepped into the room holding Jacob's hand. Her hoodie was slung over her arm, revealing her growing baby bump. "Paul, sweetheart, the cab's here," she said softly. I couldn't help but smile. "Yes, Mom," I said, turning back to her. "As you can see, Dawn is carrying my child. And the best part is, I know for a fact it's mine." I leaned down and kissed Dawn, wrapping my arm around her as we walked out. Behind us, Tiffany's sobs filled the air, echoing through the house like the final note of a sad, pathetic song. This encounter at my mother's house wasn't just an argument. It was a turning point. It reminded me why I'd chosen Dawn, why she was my future, and why the past needed to stay where it belonged. Behind us, the failed ambush at my mother's house confirmed one thing with absolute clarity. No one, not my ex-wife, my treacherous sister, nor even my well-meaning but misguided mother, could come between me and Aurora Dawn Santos. My heart was hers, fully and irrevocably. Reflecting on that day, I came to a realization. By holding her ground and standing beside me during that confrontation, Dawn proved something not only to everyone else but to herself. The quiet strength she carried along with her so-called imperfections had transformed her into a force to be reckoned with. At just 411, she was an unstoppable powerhouse wrapped in grace and love. In the aftermath, our relationship deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. While our closeness had always been fulfilling, something about that experience unlocked a new confidence in Dawn. She no longer carried the shadow of her past trauma. The pain and fear that once haunted her were finally laid to rest. That chapter of her life was closed, and with it, the need for me to tiptoe around her history. The morning after the showdown, I woke to the sight of my radiant, pregnant fiancée pressing gentle kisses on my face. Outside our hotel window in El Nido, Palawan, a rooster crowed. Fashionably late, we were already awake. Dawn, cocooned in pillows for comfort, smiled at me as a warm ocean breeze drifted into the room. This honeymoon was my surprise wedding gift to her, a trip back to her homeland of the Philippines. Jacob was happily staying with his grandparents in Zamboanga City, and from the sounds of it, both they and their grandson were thrilled with the arrangement. The cost of the trip made a respectable dent in my savings, but it was worth every penny. Dawn and I had decided to name our baby Tala, the Tagalog word for bright star. And with just 3 months until her due date, I spared no expense in pampering her and the tiny miracle growing inside her. Our days were spent exploring El Nido's pristine white sand beaches, vibrant coral reefs, and breathtaking limestone cliffs. Evenings were reserved for romantic dinners that felt nothing short of regal. Every night before bed, I massaged her growing belly with lavender oil, a thoughtful gift from a friend at her baby shower in Zamboanga. The combination of her newfound confidence and our deepened connection made every part of our time together feel magical, especially the private moments we shared. Before leaving for the honeymoon, both Dawn and I had quit our jobs. A former boss had reached out with an offer to join a new software as a service, or say as startup in California, offering a salary that dwarfed what we'd been earning combined. It was an easy decision, with 2 college funds to save for, hopefully more in the future. I accepted the role without hesitation. On the family front, Jacob was now officially my son. A quick trip to the Roswell Correctional Center secured the necessary paperwork. For $5,000 wired to his uncle Mauricio, Jacob's biological father, Danilo Santos, signed away his parental rights without argument. Soon after, the adoption was finalized. While Jacob had always been mine in my heart, knowing it was now legal brought me a peace I hadn't realized I needed. Relocating to Palo Alto was part of the deal with my new job, which meant saying goodbye to our trailers in New Mexico. To honor what Dawn had endured, I donated my trailer to a local women's crisis shelter, where it could be used as an emergency safe house. Dawn's larger trailer went to Mrs. Meyer as a gesture of gratitude for all she'd done for us. Lying next to Dawn in our cozy hotel room in El Nido, I watched her sleep peacefully, her pregnancy glow undeniable. Every moment I spent with her reaffirmed what I already knew: she was my everything. She had not only rebuilt my life, but elevated it to something I'd never dreamed possible. I had found a love worth more than all the material wealth I'd ever known. A love that felt unbreakable, unshakable. Dawn and our growing family had become my entire world, and I intended to dedicate every ounce of my being to cherishing her, protecting her, and loving her with all my heart. She was mine, and I was determined to keep it that way. When Dawn and I returned from our honeymoon in the Philippines, it felt as though we had stepped into a brand new chapter of life. Our once fragmented pasts seemed like distant memories as we focused on building a future together. The move to Palo Alto brought challenges, but it also promised opportunities neither of us had dared to dream about before. The house we bought was modest by Silicon Valley standards, but it was ours. It had 3 bedrooms, a spacious backyard for Jacob to run around in, and a small garden that Dawn quickly transformed into a vibrant space filled with tomatoes, basil, and jasmine flowers. Watching her tend to the plants, her hands gently cradling the soil, filled me with an appreciation for how she nurtured everything in her life, our family included. Jacob adjusted well to his new school. His teachers praised his enthusiasm, and he quickly made friends. It wasn't long before he came home asking if he could join the soccer team. I happily agreed and became his biggest cheerleader at every game, shouting encouragement from the sidelines as he raced up and down the field. Dawn often teased me saying, "You're more excited than the kids." She wasn't wrong. At work, my new role as a senior marketing executive proved to be both demanding and rewarding. The hours were long, but the payoff was worth it. Each evening, walking through the door to see Jacob's excited grin and Dawn's warm embrace reminded me why I worked so hard. The sacrifices were for them, for our growing family. Dawn's belly continued to swell with our baby girl, and every time I felt a kick, my heart swelled with joy. Tala was born on a crisp April morning. Dawn had insisted on a natural birth, and I stood by her side, awed by her strength. When the doctor placed our daughter in my arms, I was overwhelmed by a wave of emotions I couldn't put into words. Tala's tiny fingers curled around mine, and in that moment, the world seemed to stand still. She was perfect with Dawn's almond-shaped eyes and my stubborn chin. Looking at her, I realized I was holding not just a child, but a piece of our shared hope and love. Parenting 2 children wasn't without its challenges. Sleepless nights, diaper changes, and sibling squabbles tested our patience. But Dawn and I navigated it together. Jacob adored his baby sister, often insisting on helping with diaper changes or singing her lullabies. Watching him grow into his role as a big brother brought tears to my eyes more times than I'd like to admit. As the months turned into years, our little family blossomed. Dawn and I found ways to balance our careers in parenting. I negotiated flexible hours at work, allowing me to be home for family dinners and bedtime stories. Dawn's cooking became the heart of our household. From her famous machado to experimental dishes she learned from Filipino cooking blogs, every meal was a celebration of our love and heritage. We also made time for ourselves. Saturday nights became our date nights, whether it was watching movies after the kids were asleep or sneaking out for late-night coffee runs. Those moments reminded me of how much I cherished her, not just as the mother of my children, but as my best friend and partner in life. Her laughter was my anchor, her touch my sanctuary. One summer we decided to take a road trip across the country in a restored VW van, a nod to the vehicle that had carried me to a fresh start years ago. We stopped at national parks, visited quirky roadside attractions, and created memories that would last a lifetime. Jacob and Tala bonded over shared adventures, and watching them play together filled me with pride and gratitude. My relationship with my mother remained strained, but she softened over time. When Tala turned 2, she came to visit us in Palo Alto. Though our conversations were cautious, seeing her hold her granddaughter melted some of the tension between us. Dawn, ever the peacemaker, encouraged me to mend the relationship, but she never pushed. She knew my trust had limits, and she respected that. Life wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful. We faced our share of setbacks, unexpected expenses, work pressures, and the occasional argument, but none of it felt insurmountable. Dawn's resilience, coupled with my determination, created a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. On our 10th wedding anniversary, I surprised Dawn with a vow renewal ceremony in the backyard of our home. Surrounded by friends, family, and the laughter of our children, I once again pledged my love to her, reaffirming the promises I'd made years earlier. Dawn, radiant in a simple white dress, whispered through tears, "I'd marry you 100 times over." As I look back on our journey, I'm struck by how far we've come. From the heartbreak of betrayal to the joy of building a family, every twist and turn has brought us closer together. Dawn taught me that love isn't about perfection, it's about choosing each other every single day. And as I watch our children grow, Jacob with his boundless energy, and Tala with her quiet wisdom, I'm reminded that the best things in life are born from the courage to start over. Dawn is my forever, and I am hers. Together, we've created a life filled with laughter, love, and hope. And as the years stretch ahead, I know one thing with absolute certainty. No matter what challenges come our way, we will face them hand in hand, as we always have. This is our story, and it's only just beginning. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.